Hi, welcome. Welcome to another edition of our podcast.
This week we're going to be talking all things self-talk and how important that is, how it works and how it impacts your mental health.
Yeah, most people don't realise how much self-talk, particularly positive self-talk, really helps our mental, physical, emotional well-being and ultimately our behaviour, and helps us to achieve things that we want to achieve. Most people tend to, myself included in the past, and probably still now to a certain extent, luxuriate in negative self-talk, which ultimately can actually lead to feeling low and anxious and low self-esteem, not having any confidence, all that sort of thing. Now, Abi doesn't know about this, but I'm just going to spring a little experiment on her. Okay, yeah. You should worry about this, by the way.
My self-talk's already kicking in.
Yeah, this is it. Now, if doing something and perhaps something happens that you didn't want to happen, I mean, talk about it. I might say, okay, Abi, let's talk about what went right and what went wrong. Okay, what do you tend to focus in on?
Now, what I focus on now compared to what I would used to focus on are quite different things. I think most people would focus on what's gone wrong. It's really easy to pick out the things that have gone wrong. It's much easier to see the things that have gone wrong than the things that have gone right, is what I would say to that.
Can you try to imagine your previous self when you started to zone in on the things that went wrong? How do you think that might have made you feel?
You have sprung this one on me. I suppose I'd have been saying things to myself like, oh, that was a stupid thing to do. Why did they let that happen? What would everybody think? I should have done better. I think I'd have felt quite low about it, and I don't think I'd have felt anxious about it afterwards. I think I'd have really overthought about it. I'd have ruminated on it. I'd have probably lost sleep over it because I was really good at that. And I think worried perhaps is the word. I would have worried about it a lot, even though it's already happened, and the worrying was to no real benefit. It didn't help me to improve in the future, or I'd have just worried about the impact of it, whatever it was.
And I think to a greater or less extent, most people would. They'd sort of focus in on the wrong bit of it. Of course, the wrong bit might only be about 1% of the whole, and you forget about 99% that went right. Like you said, you think you're not good enough. You think, oh my God, this is terrible. Is it worth doing again? Blah, 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 blah. Now, just imagine then the same scenario. There's something that you've been working on and it's perhaps not quite worked out. And if I said to you, right, Abi, tell me what went right and what could be done better. How do you think you would feel then, and what would you focus in on?
I suppose there's more onus on what went right, and I might not have been able to think of a lot of things, but I suppose that seems to be the main bulk of that question. And then what to improve on, it's more of a positive spin, isn't it? You're thinking positively and helpfully towards the future, which you wouldn't if you were thinking about what went wrong. That's kind of a dead end pattern of thinking, isn't there? Because there's nowhere to go from there. If you're thinking of what could be done better, then there's almost a lesson to be learned from that.
And that's exactly the power of the self-talk. Because in one thing, just by the language that perhaps somebody else used, i.e. me in this case, could determine how you your self-talk goes. And if you're used to talking in a certain way, then it can just put you further and further down.
I think this is something that's missed quite often by people in like business leaders and teachers, and people in education don't realise how important those kind of questions are, and asking that sort of thing, especially to young children. You can build their thinking skills through that kind of questioning. And I don't think a lot of educators realise the impact of their words on their students a lot of the time. I think from a teaching background, that's one thing that I would never ever really have thought about. But yeah, that's what's sort of popping up for me, is the importance of words and how you encourage other people's self-talk. But what you're saying about that self-talk and what's wrong, I think we're almost in the habit of doing that for everything. We do it about ourselves. It's very, very easy to say what we don't like about ourselves, much more than it is to say what you do like. We feel really uncomfortable about it. I don't know if it's just a British thing. We feel very uncomfortable with giving any of our positive traits, like talking about our positive side, but we're really good at talking about what we don't like. And also what you're saying there about hindsight and it being retrospectively, I think we do it all the time with things that are going to happen. So if you've got something coming up, a job interview or a meeting at work or anything at all, we generally tend to worry about what's going to go wrong instead of imagining that event going really well and it going right. We almost plan for the worst with the belief that kind of somehow makes us feel better or more prepared, which I don't believe is true. I don't think it does make us feel better. I don't think it does make us feel prepared. I think actually it just makes us feel more anxious, and it has a physical impact on your body as well, and is more likely to make things go wrong. I don't know what your thoughts are on that, Andrew.
I believe exactly what you've said, because it's one thing, I think, having some sort of sense of preparedness in case something doesn't quite work out the way that you wanted it to. That just means then that you can move from that into make it something else, as opposed to focusing on what if it doesn't work? What, I can't do it. I'm not good enough. What if they don't like me? What if I can't get a word out at my interview? All of that sort of thing. And we know from the jobs that we do that you're actually much more likely then not to get the words out, or to stumble, or to freeze, or whatever it is that we're worried about, because we've been focusing in on that. Yeah. And so that we sort of, in a sense, talk yourself into it.
Yeah, I think what people don't always realise is that self-talk creates a narrative. It paints a picture in your head, doesn't it? And I think one thing that I remember learning through my training is that your brain doesn't know the difference between real life imagination. So when you're imagining those things going wrong, your brain thinks that's already happened. So when you get to that situation, it's already in a state of, oh, this is going to go really badly wrong. And that does have a physical impact on your body as well. You only have to look at things like phobias. If you're scared of heights, for example, it's not because you're slipping or falling, it's because your brain is telling you a story about what might happen if you slip or fall. It's painting that picture of you plummeting over the edge and hurting yourself, or, it's painting that image. And your brain thinks that's a real thing. So it creates stress. Your heart rate increases. You start to get those sweaty palms and your jelly legs and all those things that come with it, based on something that's purely happening in your imagination that has been 100% created by the way that you're talking to yourself, that self-talk.
Indeed it is. That reminded me, just as you were speaking there, Darren Brown did a video, and it's on YouTube, with Henry the high wire artist. Just for the people that don't know who Henry is, he was the world champion at skipping on a high wire tightrope. He didn't use any safety equipment, and he had never fallen off. I'm not going to say any more. You can sort of work it out, but go and have a look at it. It's quite an interesting sort of thing to see how, just in the world in general, things like self-talk are most noticeable in like sport.
Yeah.
But like you say, they happen all the time. Something you mentioned earlier, I don't want to forget, and it was about support. When we do positive self-talk, we're supporting ourselves. we're not relying on other people, external support.
Yeah.
Whereas when we have negative self-talk, we're not supporting ourselves, and maybe we might change our mind a little bit from external support, but probably not, because we won't believe it when somebody says, well, you are good enough, or whatever. No, I'm not.
Yeah,
And
if it doesn't back up that picture that you've got of yourself, then it doesn't matter how many people say that to you, you're never going to believe it, because it doesn't fit your belief. It's a square peg, round hole job, isn't it?
yeah, and the way to start to change that is actually become aware of the fact of, how do you talk to yourself? Basically, how do you think? Because we've talked about this before in other episodes of the podcast, but the way that we think is the way that we think, which affects the way that we think.
Yeah.
For the vast majority of people, the way that we express the way that we think is through an internal dialogue.
Mm-hmm.
And so the words that we use are going to be reflected by the general way that we think.
Yeah, because I just want to add in there, because I think it's your thoughts and your self-talk that create emotions. Emotions don't just pop up out of nowhere. It might feel like they do, but actually it's the things that you're saying to yourself that create those feelings. You know, if you're scared of dogs, for example, and you're walking past the dog, it's your self-talk going, oh my God, you know, look at those teeth, what if it bites me, look at it pulling on the lead. And that picture of that you're creating of that dog chasing you down the road trying to bite you, it's those thoughts that create that feeling of panic, of fear, not the dog. The dog's probably just sitting there minding its own business. So it is that self-talk that creates those feelings as well.
And don't forget, what is it we have about somewhere between 60 and 70,000 thoughts a day?
Yeah.
Well, every single one of those thoughts is going to be influenced by the way that we think, therefore the way we talk to ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
So again,
and it becomes a habit, isn't it? It becomes a habit as well, because your brain really is, it takes a lot of energy to run your brain. So your brain has to be quite lazy to work effectively. So it picks up on snap judgments, quick decisions. It does things repetitively and quickly so that it doesn't have to work so hard. So when you get into these patterns of thinking, they just become what you do, whether you realize it or not. And it just becomes your automatic way of thinking. And it is just a bad habit. And the beauty of a bad habit is you can change it.
Yeah, and that's it. So you can change the habit, you can change the self-talk. Now, this does not mean that you will never, ever worry, doubt, feel anxious, all those things. It just means that you won't be in a perpetual state of that. You'll have some respite anyway, even at the very worst. And you can change the way you think. I mean, just a little example of how to become aware of your thoughts. Actually, all you need to do is just spend 5 or 10 minutes just having a sit down, a quiet place if possible, or just go for a wee walk, whatever it might be, and just become aware of the thoughts that come in your mind. But don't try and analyze them. Don't try and think, oh, I shouldn't be having that. I'm doing a positive talk exercise. No, just be aware of how you sort of talk to yourself, and so that you then are able to, oh yeah, that's it. And moving on from that, once you sort of feel comfortable doing that, when you have some negative self-talk, I don't know, I'm stupid, I'm not good enough, I made a mistake, whatever that is, challenge that thought, so that you say, well, what proof is there that that's actually true? And just because you've had the thought doesn't mean it's true.
Yeah.
Because it's just a thought.
And how helpful is that thought as well? You know, is that helpful? Is it making you feel good? Is it making you feel in control? And if it's not, change it for something that is. And even if that means looking at it from somebody else's perspective, I find that can be helpful sometimes. Look at it from somebody else's point of view. Well, what would that person have to say about it or think about it.
Yeah.
Sometimes, especially if you're in that habit and you have been for a long time and it feels quite daunting, using somebody else's perspective can be quite a helpful tool to do that. It's called elastic thinking, I think.
Yeah, that's right. And that's actually a good point you made there, that perhaps we shouldn't call them positive and negative thoughts. We'll call them helpful and unhelpful.
Yeah.
We both know that sometimes positive can be negative and vice versa. But
yeah, you can not every situation is positive. You can still have helpful thoughts in a negative situation, can't you? And I think that's really important to recognise, actually.
Yeah, and so we'll talk about them as being helpful thoughts. Are basically helpful to allow you to experience and do things that you would enjoy, you want to do, that make life easier for you, etc. All of that thing. There was another thing that you mentioned, I've completely forgotten about it, and hopefully it will come back. When you challenge a thought, you say, what's the proof for that? I mean, you can even do that writing down. You can sort of write down the thought that you've got and draw a line down the middle of the page. And on one side is all the actual real evidence you have for that thought. And on the other side of the page is the evidence that doesn't support that thought. And most times I think you'd be quite surprised. And even something you thought was quite a strong conviction about something, there's actually no evidence for it, apart from the fact that you think it.
Or at least if you challenge it, there's always going to be evidence on the other side. I think if you really look at the other side of the coin, there's always going to be evidence to back that up as well, which has got to challenge you. But I think quite often, particularly with unhelpful thoughts, very good at trying to ignore them. Oh, that's a silly thing to think, like, don't waste your time on that, just go and do something else. But that's not always helpful. I think we lose that sense of self-awareness by not paying attention, because I think it's much better to listen to those thoughts and do something about them rather than just try and ignore them, because just because you're ignoring them doesn't mean they're not there. And them still being there in the background is still having an impact on you. So I think it's actually better to pay attention and listen to the thoughts that you're having so that you can take control and do something about them. And it's a skill, isn't it? It's a skill. And if you're learning any new skill, it needs practice. I've been watching my nearly 4-year-old trying to learn to ride his bike this week. Bless him. I've got 2 sort of points to make on this one. He's fallen off quite a lot of times this week. You know, you don't learn a new skill and just be amazing at it straight away. He's kicked his bike, he's stamped his foot about it, he's had a bit of paddy about it. But at the same time, I've also heard him going, come on, you can do this. Just don't give up. Have another go. And I was so proud of him for that self-talk, because I could hear him chatting to himself going, come on, have another go. You can do it. And I just thought, oh, that is brilliant self-talk. You know, he hasn't given up. He's really challenging himself. And actually, every time he's coming with a smile on his face, and he's getting a little bit better every time. That doesn't mean he's never going to fall off again. He definitely is. He's only 3. But actually, the fact that he can work through that by himself and challenge himself and think more helpful things that spur him on by himself, I was super proud of him this week.
You're quite right, yes.
Yeah,
that's brilliant.
And I just stood there and thought, you know what, there's a lot of grown-ups that don't do that.
Yeah. Henry Ford, to paraphrase his famous saying, is, if you believe you can and you believe you can't, you're right.
Yeah.
That's true. And because you have the self-talk, I can't do that. I can't, no, it'll never work. And therefore don't do it.
And it comes down to Coué's law as well. And I think we've talked about Emile Coué in previous chats that we've had. And Emile Coué was a French psychologist, and he created the placebo effect. So he worked a lot on the impact of imagination on the physical body. And there was something called Coué's law, and that talks all about imagining what you want to happen instead of what you fear might happen. We spend a lot of time thinking about what might go wrong. Just as how we started this conversation, we spend a huge amount of time worrying about what might happen. But imagine how different things would be if we planned what we wanted to happen. And that doesn't mean that you can guarantee the outcome, but actually if you plan things going well, if you plan feeling calm and being successful, then that's much more likely to to be the case because your brain thinks that's already happened. So you can almost trick your brain into feeling more confident, to believing that things are going to go well, just by your self-talk and the pictures that you create in your brain through that self-talk. So imagination's a really powerful tool as well, isn't it?
Yes, oh, definitely. And MLQ is really interesting, and you can see that in every aspect of life. And maybe we'll do a podcast just about Emil and his thoughts. You might say, well, I've got this thought and I made a mistake, so it proves I can't do it. Well, and I made a mistake proves I can't do it, or I'm stupid, or just not good enough. Is you telling yourself, well, I'm stupid, I'm not good enough. And the more you tell yourself that, the more you believe it, and the more you tell yourself it. And also, then when something else doesn't necessarily work out the way that you want it to, that just proves it. That's called confirmation bias.
Yeah.
And the more confirmation bias we have, the more it just sort of proves our own theory, our own thought.
And confirmation bias, for people that don't know what that is, that's when you see more of what you're looking for. So if you are thinking about yellow cars, you're pretty much guaranteed to see more yellow cars than you ordinarily would. If you think people don't like you, then you're going to see, or you're going to imagine that you see people looking at you funny or trying to ignore you, or you're going to pick up on those things, even if those things are 2 things out of 5,000, those are the things that you'll focus on. Your confirmation bias is the evidence and data that you focus on that backs up your beliefs. So if you've got those beliefs that people don't like you, or you're stupid, or you can't do anything right, you're only going to pick up the information that backs that up. It's going to be very focused and filtered information. And actually, the reality is that there's going to be lots of other information and proof and evidence that completely proves you wrong, but you won't see it because it's not what you're looking for.
If you have a thought that, I'm stupid, then you say, well, yeah, okay, I made a mistake, but I now know how not to do that. Or I now can think of a way to do that better, which means that you've taken control of it. You've also then feeling positive because you've got that helpful attitude and you're moving forward in a sense. You're not going, thinking about the past and that was terrible, I'm stupid. And
that kind of thinking will boost your self-esteem as well, rather than I'm stupid, that will lower your self-esteem. So taking action and feeling more in control will make you feel much more able to cope with whatever the situation is. And nobody gets everything right all the time. That's completely unrealistic. That doesn't mean that you're a failure or you're stupid or any of those things. So it's about looking at things from a realistic and helpful perspective, rather than that disempowering, I say negative, unhelpful perspective.
Yeah. And you mentioned earlier on about you would talk to somebody else about something. Well, be kind to yourself. Treat yourself with the same sort of kindness as your friend.
Yeah, if you had a friend that spoke to you in the way that you speak to yourself, would you still be the friend? That's the question you've got to ask yourself, isn't it? Would you still be that person's friend if they spoke to you the way that you speak to yourself? And I think for a lot of people, absolutely not. So why is it okay to talk to yourself like that? Really, you're the only person that is guaranteed to be there for you for your entire life. Yeah. You should be your own best friend, and yet we're not. We're our own worst enemy a lot of the time. We're more critical to ourselves than we are to any other person. We judge ourselves more harshly than we would anybody else. Yeah. And we never stop to question why or the impact that has on us.
And that's very true, because you're the only you have. Mm-hmm. You are your own best friend. You're also the person that you can help the most and support. So be kind to yourself. And look after yourself. Just another thing is, like Abi said earlier on, it's a skill. It's you're changing a pattern that you might have had for years and years and years. So you'll change it relatively quickly, but you've got to keep practicing doing it. You can't just go once. Well, that didn't work, did it? and that's negative. So
I think people think that if they've been set in their ways for a long time, or the longer they've been set in their ways, the harder it is. But actually, it only takes 2 to 4 weeks to change a habit, no matter how long you've had it for. So if you can be persistent in challenging those unhelpful thoughts when they come, and you can do that over a couple of weeks and really listen to those thoughts and do something about them, you'll find that actually quite quickly that will be a new pattern of thinking, and those more helpful thoughts will just start coming to you as second nature, and that will accelerate, I guess, over time if you keep on top of it.
Yeah. There is sometimes in psychology books, you get told to do affirmations. Now, affirmations in the right setting and the right type of thing are really quite powerful tools to have. But it's not just a case of saying, I'm great, I'm great, I'm great.
I think affirmations on their own like that are not necessarily, I'm going to be controversial here, aren't I? I think affirmations on that own, where you're just repeating something to yourself, don't hold much value as a practice by itself. Looking in a mirror and saying, I'm strong, I am brave, I am whatever it is, over and over again, isn't enough by itself, because just saying it doesn't mean that you're going to believe it. In fact, you're actually more likely to be going, oh, it's just not true, is it? Because all your evidence backs up the opposite. So an affirmation really is only helpful if you're going to add some evidence to that belief, if you're going to work on it and look for things that back it up, because I think just the statement on its own isn't enough to convince you that it's true.
Mm-hmm. I think if you do all the other things that we mentioned, then doing affirmation as well is fine. But like Abi says, you need that sort of foundation for it to.
It needs substance, doesn't it? It needs the substance. You need to bulk that out with some logic and evidence as well.
Mm-hmm. There's just some thoughts about self-talk. We all do it. It's not something that only that person over there does, or that one over there. It's nothing to do with me. It's all to do with you.
If you don't think it is, you're not listening to your thoughts hard enough.
Right. So I think we'll leave it at there at the moment. But if anybody wants to know any more about that, just drop us a line, get in touch. All the details at the end of this wee video. And look forward to seeing you again in a few weeks' time. Bye-bye.
Yep. See you soon. Bye.